The most dangerous person in a royal hall is rarely the one wearing a crown. The Crystal Moon Palace shimmered beneath thousands of golden lanterns, their warm light dancing across polished marble floors that reflected every elegant step taken by nobles from every corner of the Northern Territories. Crystal chandeliers stretched overhead like frozen constellations, while a string quartet filled the vast ballroom with graceful melodies that softened even the proudest expressions. Servants moved with quiet precision between tables covered in silver, crystal glasses, and towering arrangements of white lilies. Every detail had been planned to celebrate peace after years of rivalry among the strongest packs. At the center of it all sat Alpha King Ethan Blackwood, calm, composed, and impossible to ignore. Even seated, he carried the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his authority because everyone in the room already knew it. His dark suit was tailored with understated perfection, a silver wolf crest pinned over his heart reflecting the candlelight each time he turned to greet another honored guest. Conversations naturally lowered whenever he spoke, not because anyone had been ordered to remain silent, but because respect had become instinct around him. Far from the royal table, moving almost unnoticed between crowded aisles with a polished serving tray balanced effortlessly in both hands, Emily Carter blended into the rhythm of the evening exactly as expected. At 23, she had worked countless banquets inside the palace, yet almost no one remembered her name. To most guests, she was simply another Omega waitress in a gray uniform whose purpose began and ended with keeping glasses full and tables spotless. Earlier that evening, an impatient nobleman had brushed past her shoulder, spilling dark berry wine across the front of her apron before casually blaming her without waiting for an answer. Emily had simply smiled, apologized softly, and excused herself to replace the stained fabric. The noble never looked back. That was how people usually treated her. Invisible, replaceable, easy to overlook. What no one noticed was that Emily never reacted the way ordinary people did. While others focused on embarrassment, she quietly memorized details. Every doorway, every staircase, every balcony overlooking the ballroom, every servant entrance hidden behind velvet curtains, every security rotation timed almost to the second. Years of habit had taught her to observe first and speak last. Her pale blue eyes drifted naturally across the room without appearing suspicious, catching tiny movements hidden beneath polished smiles. She noticed which guests laughed too loudly, which ones never touched the expensive food placed before them, and which hands remained strangely free despite formal etiquette requiring wine glasses throughout the reception. Most people believed kindness came from innocence. Emily knew kindness survived because awareness came first. As another tray of sparkling cider disappeared into waiting hands, she glanced toward the grand entrance where 5 distinguished visitors had arrived separately throughout the evening. Each represented a different allied territory. Their clothing reflected different regional traditions, their accents varied, and their introductions had earned respectful applause. Yet something about them quietly refused to fit. None appeared nervous before meeting the Alpha King. None seemed interested in the lavish celebration surrounding them. Instead, each occasionally exchanged the briefest glance with another across the crowded ballroom before returning to effortless conversation as though nothing had happened. It lasted less than a heartbeat each time, so subtle that almost everyone missed it completely. Emily did not. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly beneath the silver serving tray. She reminded herself that suspicion alone proved nothing. Still, she found herself counting. One glance, then another. 5 strangers. 5 perfectly timed acknowledgments. No wasted motion. No unnecessary conversation between them. Almost as though they already understood exactly where everyone else would be standing before the evening even began. A faint chill brushed across her skin despite the warmth of the ballroom. She slowly exhaled and continued serving another table without changing her expression. Nearby, musicians shifted into a brighter melody as laughter spread through the hall. Crystal glasses lifted. Toasts echoed beneath painted ceilings. Everything looked exactly as a royal celebration should. Yet Emily's instincts refused to settle. Somewhere beneath the polished elegance, beneath the music and practiced smiles, invisible pieces were sliding quietly into place. She could not explain why. only that every lesson whispered long ago by the grandmother who had raised her returned with startling clarity. Never fear the loudest voice in the room. Watch the quiet ones. They decide how the story ends. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully as she approached the royal section with another tray, but inside, every instinct she possessed had already begun preparing for a night that would change far more than anyone inside the Crystal Moon Palace could possibly imagine. Emily Carter continued moving gracefully between polished tables as if nothing inside the ballroom had changed, but every quiet glance exchanged among the 5 distinguished visitors weighed heavier with each passing minute. Their timing was too perfect. Whenever one shifted toward a different part of the hall, another naturally filled the empty space without attracting attention. To everyone else, they looked like respected diplomats enjoying a royal celebration. To Emily, they looked like people following a carefully rehearsed rhythm. She set another crystal glass onto a silver tray and paused beside a towering arrangement of white lilies just long enough to study the reflection in the nearby window. Reflections often revealed what direct observation could not. One guest smiled warmly while greeting an elderly nobleman, yet his eyes never followed the conversation. Instead, they remained fixed for the briefest instant on the royal platform, where Alpha King Ethan Blackwood continued welcoming honored representatives with calm confidence. Another visitor adjusted his jacket sleeve, revealing the corner of an unfamiliar silver emblem before quickly covering it again. Emily had worked enough diplomatic events to recognize nearly every official crest in the northern territories. This one belonged to none of them. The orchestra began another elegant performance as servants carried fresh desserts into the ballroom. Warm cinnamon, roasted apples, and fresh honey drifted through the air, drawing delighted smiles from the guests. Laughter returned. Glasses lifted. Someone proposed another toast celebrating lasting unity between neighboring packs. Even the royal guards standing along the marble walls appeared more relaxed than before. Emily wished she could share their confidence, but the quiet warning inside her only grew stronger. Her grandmother had once told her that danger often arrived wearing polished shoes and a pleasant smile, because true threats preferred invitations over forced entrances. Emily had laughed at the story as a little girl. Tonight, she remembered every word. As she approached another table, a folded linen napkin slipped from the edge of her serving tray. She bent naturally to retrieve it, and from that lower angle, she noticed something hidden beneath one of the banquet tables. A polished leather case rested against a chair leg where no servant would ever leave personal belongings. Before she could look closer, a noblewoman politely thanked her for replacing an empty glass. Emily smiled, completed her task, and continued walking without revealing the sudden tension rising inside her chest. Several feet away, one of the 5 visitors casually brushed past another. They never stopped. They never exchanged a single word. Yet the second visitor immediately changed direction toward the center of the ballroom. A third slowly drifted closer to the musicians. The remaining 2 positioned themselves near opposite exits. No guest seemed alarmed because nothing appeared unusual. Their movements blended naturally into the celebration. Emily quietly counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Every position now surrounded the royal platform without drawing suspicion. Her pulse quickened. She carried another tray toward the serving station while pretending to organize polished glasses. From there she could observe nearly the entire ballroom. The royal guards remained focused on the obvious entrances, unaware that attention itself had become the distraction. Ethan Blackwood stood to acknowledge another welcoming speech, accepting warm applause from every direction. His composed smile never faltered. Emily wondered whether he had noticed the invisible pattern forming around him. She hoped he had. Yet something inside her whispered that even someone as experienced as the Alpha King could not prepare for a danger no one believed existed. Suddenly, one of the distinguished visitors raised his glass higher than the others. It looked like a simple gesture of celebration. Across the ballroom, another guest responded by adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. A third turned exactly 1 step toward the orchestra. The signals lasted less than a second, disappearing beneath applause and cheerful conversation. Emily's heart sank. They were communicating in plain sight because they knew nobody was looking closely enough to understand. She placed her tray onto the nearest service table without making a sound. Her breathing slowed instead of quickening. Every lesson her grandmother had taught her returned with remarkable clarity. Stay calm before everyone else realizes there is a reason to panic. Watch where people are going, not where they pretend to be looking. Protect first. Explain later. The music reached its brightest crescendo just as Ethan Blackwood accepted another ceremonial glass prepared for the next royal toast. Around him, smiling faces reflected the golden chandelier light. Around him, loyal guards remained alert. Around him, honored guests applauded another hopeful promise of peace. And hidden perfectly within that celebration, 5 carefully positioned rivals waited for the exact same moment to begin whatever they had traveled across the kingdom to accomplish. Emily took one silent step toward the royal platform, no longer serving the banquet, but following an instinct she could not afford to ignore. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a raised voice or a sudden commotion. It came from silence. Emily Carter noticed at the instant the orchestra reached the final note of the royal toast. One violinist briefly lifted his eyes toward the eastern balcony. Instead of following the conductor, a palace steward hesitated beside a column as though waiting for an instruction that never came. Even the candles nearest the grand entrance seemed to flicker against a draft that should not have existed inside the sealed ballroom. Around her, hundreds of guests continued smiling, talking, and raising crystal glasses, completely unaware that the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be measured with words alone. Emily slowly reached for another serving tray, using the polished silver surface to study the room without appearing to stare. The reflections confirmed what her instincts had already whispered. The 5 distinguished visitors had completed their quiet repositioning. Each stood far enough apart to avoid suspicion, yet close enough to see one another without turning their heads. They had formed an almost invisible circle around the royal platform. It was too deliberate to be coincidence. She forced herself to breathe slowly. Panic had never helped anyone notice the truth. Her grandmother had always repeated that observation belonged to those who could remain calm, while everyone else surrendered to emotion. Emily remembered practicing that lesson as a child while learning to identify birds by the sound of their wings instead of their colors. She had never understood why such strange exercises mattered. Tonight, every forgotten lesson suddenly carried meaning. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood accepted congratulations from another delegation with his usual composed confidence. His posture remained relaxed, his smile genuine, and his attention appeared fixed on the conversation before him. Yet Emily noticed something else. Every few seconds his eyes quietly scanned the ballroom before returning to his guests. He was alert, but he was watching the obvious places. Whoever planned this had expected exactly that. Emily carefully stepped toward the refreshment station nearest the royal platform. Another waitress greeted her with a cheerful smile and asked whether she could replace an empty pitcher. Emily nodded, grateful for the excuse to move closer without attracting attention. As she lifted the pitcher, she caught a brief reflection inside the polished silver lid. A sixth face appeared for only a heartbeat. A man wearing the plain black uniform of a palace servant stood beside one of the marble pillars with perfect posture, yet Emily had never seen him working inside the palace before. Every servant recognized one another after enough banquets. She knew the kitchen staff, the musicians, the cleaning crews, even the seasonal workers hired during festivals. This man belonged to none of them. Before she could study him again, he disappeared behind a passing group of noble guests. Emily looked naturally toward the pillar. Empty. Her pulse skipped once. 5 visitors. 1 unfamiliar servant. 6 people connected by timing instead of conversation. The realization settled quietly inside her. The 5 rivals everyone would notice were never meant to finish the plan themselves. They were drawing every pair of watchful eyes while someone else waited where nobody would think to look. She lowered the pitcher onto the serving table with steady hands, refusing to let her concern appear on her face. Across the ballroom, one of the distinguished visitors deliberately laughed at a light-hearted story, encouraging nearby guests to gather closer. Another politely asked a royal advisor about trade routes, drawing 2 guards into the conversation. A third complimented the musicians, causing several attendants to shift their attention toward the orchestra. None of those actions seemed unusual alone. Together, they quietly redirected the room exactly where they wanted it. Emily glanced once more toward the marble pillar. The unfamiliar servant had already moved again. This time she found him only because she was searching for reflections instead of people. His image flashed across a decorative mirror framed in carved oak before disappearing behind a curtain leading toward the private corridor connected to the royal platform. He was not approaching from the front. He was taking the hidden route known only to palace employees. Emily's heartbeat remained surprisingly calm. Fear tried to rise inside her, but another feeling pushed it aside. Certainty. She no longer wondered whether something was about to happen. She knew it. Without asking permission or waiting for proof that everyone else would accept, she quietly set down her serving tray and adjusted the sleeves of her simple gray uniform. To every guest in the Crystal Moon Palace, she still looked like an ordinary Omega waitress preparing for another round of service. Only Emily understood that every second mattered now, because while the entire ballroom watched 5 carefully smiling rivals, the person who truly threatened the Alpha King was already walking through the palace shadows completely unnoticed. Emily Carter slipped away from the serving station with the same quiet composure she had shown all evening, careful not to attract a single curious glance. Around her, the celebration continued without interruption. Crystal glasses touched gently together, refined laughter floated beneath the vaulted ceiling, and another welcoming speech began near the royal platform. To everyone else, the evening remained exactly as it had been only moments before. Emily alone could feel the invisible countdown pressing against every heartbeat. She followed the edge of the ballroom instead of crossing through the center, keeping marble columns between herself and the unfamiliar servant she had spotted through the reflections. Each careful step confirmed what her instincts already believed. The man was not performing any palace duty. He never greeted guests. He never accepted instructions from senior staff. He simply continued moving with quiet purpose toward the private corridor leading behind the royal platform. Emily remembered delivering refreshments through that passage during previous banquets. It connected directly to a small chamber reserved for members of the royal household before official ceremonies. Few guests even knew it existed. If someone wished to approach the Alpha King without crossing the crowded ballroom, there was no better route. She reached the entrance to the corridor just as another servant emerged carrying folded table linens. Emily smiled politely, accepted the stack without hesitation, and continued walking as though she had been assigned the task herself. The simple bundle of white cloth concealed her face just enough to avoid unnecessary attention while allowing her to move naturally through the restricted hallway. The music from the ballroom became softer with every step until only distant echoes remained. Warm candlelight reflected across polished stone walls decorated with portraits of former rulers whose calm expressions seemed to watch every visitor in silence. Ahead, the unfamiliar servant slowed beside an ornate wooden door leading toward the royal preparation room. He glanced once over his shoulder. Emily immediately lowered her eyes toward the folded linens, appearing to adjust their position. After a brief pause, the man disappeared through another narrow passage branching toward the platform. Emily counted silently to 3 before continuing. She reached the corner and stopped. The passage beyond stood empty, yet a second door near the end remained slightly open. Through the narrow opening, she caught a glimpse of dark fabric disappearing around another turn. He was moving quickly now. Whatever he had been waiting for inside the ballroom had already begun. Emily gently placed the folded linens onto a decorative bench and listened. Footsteps echoed faintly ahead, steady and controlled. Then she heard something else. The applause from the ballroom suddenly grew louder. Another ceremonial toast. Everyone would be looking toward the Alpha King. Everyone except her. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment as memories she had not revisited in years surfaced with surprising clarity. Her grandmother standing beneath tall pine trees. Patient hands guiding her feet across uneven ground. A quiet voice repeating the same lesson until it became instinct. Never fight force with force when a single step can change everything. Balance decides more battles than strength. Observe the path before choosing the motion. Emily opened her eyes. Her breathing steadied. She did not feel frightened anymore. She simply understood what needed to be done. Moving silently through the corridor, she reached the final doorway overlooking the side of the royal platform. From there, she could see Ethan Blackwood accepting another crystal glass while thanking his guest for their trust and friendship. The 5 distinguished visitors remained exactly where she had expected, smiling politely among the crowd. Every guard watched them. No one watched the narrow staircase hidden behind the platform. A faint movement caught the corner of her vision. The unfamiliar servant emerged from the shadows of the staircase with measured confidence, no longer behaving like palace staff. His attention never shifted toward the guests. It remained fixed entirely on the Alpha King. Emily stepped forward before she had time to question herself. Her shoes barely made a sound against the polished stone as she crossed the remaining distance. The man sensed movement and turned slightly, surprised to find only an ordinary Omega Waitress standing in his path. For the briefest instant, both remained perfectly still. Emily noticed the smallest change in his shoulders, the subtle shift of weight toward one foot, the preparation that revealed intention before action. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize that silent language long before words became necessary. Without raising her voice or showing anger, Emily moved. One smooth step carried her just outside the line he expected. Her hand lightly redirected his reaching arm, while her other hand guided his balance away from the narrow staircase. It happened so naturally that neither movement appeared forceful. Momentum simply followed a different direction. The unfamiliar man stumbled one controlled step backward, more surprised than harmed, his carefully planned approach broken before it had truly begun. At that exact moment, the nearest royal guard looked toward the unexpected motion, and the quiet certainty Emily had carried all evening transformed into something no one inside the Crystal Moon Palace could ignore any longer. The unexpected movement froze the quiet rhythm of the evening more effectively than any shouted warning ever could. Conversations faded one by one as nearby guests turned toward the side corridor, trying to understand why an ordinary Omega Waitress had suddenly stepped between the royal platform and a palace servant. Emily Carter remained perfectly still, her breathing calm, her posture relaxed, and her eyes fixed on the unfamiliar man who no longer looked like someone carrying out routine duties. His carefully practiced confidence had disappeared, replaced by visible surprise that lasted only a heartbeat before royal guards rapidly closed the distance. Within seconds, the hidden passage was secured without panic spreading through the ballroom. Most guests never understood exactly what had happened. They only sensed that something important had been prevented before it could interrupt the celebration. The orchestra gradually lowered its instruments, uncertain whether to continue playing. Palace attendants exchanged confused glances, while noble families quietly whispered among themselves. Every version of the story sounded different, because no one had seen the entire sequence unfold. Some believed the servant had wandered into a restricted corridor by mistake. Others insisted he had simply lost his footing. A few claimed the young waitress had somehow anticipated his movement before anyone else even noticed him. Emily herself offered no explanation. She simply stepped aside as the royal guards respectfully took control of the situation. One commander studied the corridor with a puzzled expression before looking back toward Emily. He had trained elite protectors for nearly 20 years and had witnessed countless security exercises, yet he could not understand what he had just seen. The young woman had not relied on strength, speed, or aggression. She had redirected the stranger with such remarkable precision that the entire encounter appeared almost effortless. Even more unusual, the man himself looked genuinely confused, as though the outcome had contradicted everything he expected. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood quietly descended from the royal platform despite several advisors urging him to remain where it was safer. His calm presence immediately settled the growing uncertainty inside the ballroom. The crowd naturally stepped aside as he approached the corridor. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully the moment she realized he was standing only a few feet away. She expected someone to thank the guards, ask routine questions, and send her back to work. Instead, silence lingered. Ethan studied the young waitress with thoughtful curiosity rather than suspicion. Earlier that evening, she had been almost invisible among dozens of palace employees. Now every person nearby found themselves looking in her direction. The Alpha King finally spoke with the same calm voice that had guided the kingdom through years of difficult negotiations. "Are you injured?" Emily looked up, slightly surprised by the question. She gently shook her head. "No, Your Majesty." Ethan nodded once before turning toward the commander. "Was anyone else harmed?" The commander answered immediately. "No, Your Majesty. Thanks to her, The situation remained under control before it reached the ballroom. The words echoed farther than anyone intended. Thanks to her, guests exchanged another round of uncertain whispers. Several nobles glanced toward Emily with expressions that had completely changed since the beginning of the banquet. Hours earlier, many of them had walked past her without noticing she existed. Now they struggled to reconcile the quiet waitress with the remarkable composure she had displayed only moments before. Emily wished the attention would disappear. She had never wanted recognition. She only wanted everyone to remain safe. Yet Ethan Blackwood continued observing her with quiet interest. He replayed the brief encounter in his mind exactly as he had witnessed it from the platform. There had been no panic in her movements. No hesitation. No wasted effort. Most people reacted after recognizing danger. Somehow, Emily had acted before anyone else even realized there was reason for concern. That difference fascinated him far more than the movement itself. Nearby, one elderly royal advisor slowly adjusted his spectacles while studying Emily from across the corridor. His thoughtful expression deepened with every passing second. He did not focus on her face or the simple gray uniform she still wore. Instead, his attention remained fixed on the way she naturally shifted her weight while standing at rest. There was something strangely familiar about her balance, the quiet alignment of her shoulders, the effortless control of every step she took. It reminded him of illustrations he had seen only inside forgotten historical records preserved beneath the royal library. He frowned slightly, uncertain whether memory was playing tricks on him. Emily noticed none of this. She simply bent to retrieve the folded linens she had placed on the decorative bench earlier, intending to return them to the serving station as though the evening could continue normally. Before she could take a single step away, the elderly advisor softly whispered only a few words to himself. That cannot be possible. Ethan heard the remark immediately and turned toward the old scholar, whose eyes never left the quiet Omega Waitress, as though he had just recognized the first forgotten clue to a mystery buried for generations. The elderly royal advisor slowly stepped forward, his attention fixed entirely on Emily Carter as though the crowded ballroom had disappeared around him. His hands trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief. For decades, he had devoted his life to preserving the forgotten history of the kingdom, studying ancient journals, faded paintings, and handwritten records that few people even remembered existed. Yet nothing had prepared him to witness those movements with his own eyes. Emily stood quietly beside the folded linens, uncertain why so many people were suddenly looking at her. She lowered her gaze respectfully, hoping someone would simply tell her to return to her duties. Instead, the advisor stopped only a few feet away. His voice remained gentle, almost hesitant, as if speaking too loudly might cause the memory itself to disappear. "Young lady," he asked softly, "who taught you to move that way?" Emily blinked in surprise. She had never considered her movements unusual. "My grandmother," she answered honestly. "She said balance mattered more than strength. She practiced with me almost every morning when I was growing up." The advisor slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment before exhaling. Around them, conversations had faded into complete silence. Even the palace attendants listened without realizing they had stopped working. Ethan Blackwood watched the exchange carefully, sensing there was far more behind the old scholar's question than simple curiosity. "Did your grandmother ever give that practice a name?" the Alpha King asked calmly. Emily thought for a moment before shaking her head. "No, Your Majesty. She only called it an old family tradition. She always smiled whenever I asked where it came from, but she never explained anything else." The advisor opened his eyes again, and they carried the unmistakable weight of recognition. "Because she could not," he whispered. There were very few people left who even remembered its true name. Several nobles exchanged puzzled glances while the commander folded his arms, waiting for an explanation. The advisor turned toward the Alpha King. "Your Majesty, I believe we have all just witnessed the Silver Moon Guardian art." A quiet murmur swept through the nearby guests. Most had never heard those words before. Ethan himself remained composed, although the name stirred a distant memory from stories told during his childhood education. The advisor continued, his voice growing steadier with every sentence. "More than 3 centuries ago, the royal bloodline was protected by a small order whose members believed that wisdom, timing, and discipline could prevent conflict before force ever became necessary. They served beside the throne without seeking titles or recognition. Their greatest achievement was ending danger before anyone else realized it had begun. Emily listened with growing confusion. Every description sounded strangely familiar, yet she had never read those stories or studied royal history. To her, those quiet exercises had simply been mornings spent laughing with the grandmother who raised her after her parents disappeared from her life. "That cannot be possible," Emily said softly. "I am only a waitress." The advisor smiled with quiet kindness. "Perhaps that is exactly why no one noticed until today." Ethan looked at Emily once more, seeing not only the humble Omega who had served guests all evening, but someone carrying a forgotten legacy without ever realizing it. Before anyone could ask another question, Emily instinctively reached beneath the collar of her simple uniform to steady herself. As her fingers brushed the small silver pendant she had worn since childhood, the advisor's expression changed once again. His eyes widened as though he had recognized something even more extraordinary than the ancient technique itself. The elderly advisor took one slow step closer, his eyes never leaving the small silver pendant resting against Emily Carter's hand. Time itself seemed to pause inside the Crystal Moon Palace. The nobles who only moments earlier had whispered about an unexpected disturbance now stood in complete silence, sensing that they were witnessing something far greater than a simple palace incident. Emily looked down at the pendant with quiet confusion. It was an ordinary part of her life, no different from the simple gray uniform she wore every day. Her grandmother had fastened the delicate chain around her neck when she was 6 years old and had gently reminded her never to take it off, no matter where life carried her. Emily had obeyed without ever asking again. To her, it had always been nothing more than a keepsake from the only family she had ever known. The advisor slowly raised a trembling hand, but stopped before touching it. "May I see it?" he asked with sincere respect. Emily nodded and carefully removed the necklace, placing it into his waiting hands. The polished silver reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers as the old scholar turned it over. Hidden beneath years of ordinary wear, he noticed an almost invisible engraving surrounding the edge of the pendant. His breath caught. "This seal," he whispered, "has not been seen in generations." Ethan Blackwood stepped closer, studying the tiny symbol with calm concentration. It resembled a crescent moon embracing a standing wolf, surrounded by delicate branches carved with extraordinary precision. The Alpha King recognized none of it, but the expression on the advisor's face told him everything he needed to know. "Explain," Ethan said quietly. The advisor looked up, his voice carrying equal parts reverence and sorrow. "Your Majesty, this is the crest of the Guardian clan. They serve the throne without wealth, titles, or recognition. Their purpose was simple: protect the kingdom before danger reached the crown. History tells us they disappeared centuries ago after refusing to betray the royal bloodline during a time of great division. Official records claim the entire family line ended that winter." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. "That cannot be true," she said softly. "My grandmother never spoke about any guardian clan. She only raised me in a small village. We lived a very ordinary life." The advisor smiled gently. "Sometimes the greatest way to preserve a legacy is to hide it where no one thinks to search." Emily's thoughts drifted back to quiet mornings beneath towering pine trees, where her grandmother corrected the smallest movement of her feet with patient kindness. She remembered evenings spent repairing old fences, gathering herbs, and listening to stories that never seemed connected to kings or kingdoms. Looking back now, she realized those stories had always carried the same lesson: protect others without expecting recognition. Leave every place safer than you found it. She had believed they were simply words of wisdom from an elderly woman. Now they felt like fragments of a forgotten history. Ethan watched Emily carefully. There was no pride in her expression, no excitement at the possibility of belonging to an ancient family, only quiet uncertainty. That honesty convinced him more than any ancient record ever could. A person seeking power would have embraced the story immediately. Emily looked almost overwhelmed by it. Before anyone could continue the conversation, one of the palace historians hurried into the corridor carrying a weathered leather archive box retrieved from the royal library. He carefully unfolded a faded parchment onto a nearby table. Although time had dimmed the ink, One illustration remained unmistakably clear. It showed a guardian standing beside an ancient alpha king, wearing the very same crescent moon pendant now resting in the advisor's hands. Every eye in the corridor slowly turned back toward Emily as the impossible truth began transforming from forgotten legend into undeniable reality. The faded parchment rested beneath the chandelier light, its worn edges bearing the weight of centuries. Yet the crescent moon pendant illustrated beside the ancient guardian matched the one Emily Carter had worn since childhood with astonishing precision. No one in the corridor questioned the resemblance anymore. The whispers that had filled the palace only minutes before disappeared completely, replaced by respectful silence. Ethan Blackwood studied both the ancient drawing and the young Omega standing before him. The contrast could not have been greater. One represented a forgotten legend preserved in fragile ink. The other stood in a simple gray waitress uniform with nervous hands and quiet eyes, still struggling to understand why history had suddenly placed its attention upon her. Emily slowly accepted the pendant after the advisor returned it with both hands. She fastened it around her neck once again, almost instinctively, as though returning a missing part of herself. Memories continued surfacing one after another. Her grandmother smiling whenever she corrected Emily's posture. Long walks through the forest where every lesson focused on awareness instead of strength. Gentle reminders that true protection began long before anyone recognized danger. Those moments had never felt extraordinary while she was living them. Only now did she realize every lesson had been carefully preparing her for a future she never knew existed. Ethan turned toward the assembled nobles and royal officials who had quietly gathered near the corridor entrance. Their expressions had changed completely. Earlier that evening, many had overlooked Emily without a second glance. Some had spoken to her only when requesting another drink. Others had never acknowledged her presence at all. Now the same people waited respectfully for the Alpha King's words. Ethan removed the silver wolf crest from the front of his formal jacket. The polished emblem reflected the warm candlelight as he walked toward Emily. She immediately lowered her head, believing he intended to pass by her. Instead, he stopped directly in front of her. "Emily Carter," he said with calm sincerity. "Tonight you protected this palace without seeking recognition, without demanding reward, and without allowing fear to guide your judgment. You acted because it was the right thing to do." Emily looked up in quiet surprise, unsure how to answer. Ethan gently placed the silver crest onto the front of her simple uniform, fastening it carefully where everyone could see. A quiet wave of emotion swept through the corridor as every witness understood the meaning of the gesture. The royal crest had never been offered lightly. It represented trust earned through character rather than status. Ethan stepped back and addressed the room with a steady voice that carried naturally through the marble hall. "Let it be remembered that courage is not measured by rank, title, or reputation. Tonight this kingdom remains secure because one humble Omega chose responsibility over recognition. From this day forward, no one within my kingdom will dismiss Emily Carter as merely a waitress." For a brief moment no one moved. Then, beginning with the elderly advisor, those gathered in the corridor respectfully lowered their heads. Palace attendants followed. Royal guards did the same. One after another, nobles who had overlooked Emily throughout the evening quietly offered the same gesture of respect. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes, not because she desired honor, but because she had never imagined being seen for who she truly was. Ethan noticed the quiet humility in her expression and understood that history had revealed more than an ancient bloodline. It had revealed the kind of heart worthy of carrying it. Beyond the palace windows, the moon rose above the forest in peaceful silence, casting silver light across the towers of the kingdom. None of those inside realized that this remarkable evening would soon travel far beyond the palace walls, carrying the name of a forgotten guardian once more into a world that had believed the ancient legacy had vanished forever. The celebration slowly returned to life, yet nothing inside the Crystal Moon Palace felt quite the same. Servants resumed their duties with renewed purpose. Musicians gently filled the ballroom with quiet melodies once again, and guests continued their conversations, but every person who had witnessed the evening carried home a story that would be remembered for generations. Emily Carter stood near one of the grand windows, looking out across the moonlit gardens where soft silver light rested upon ancient trees that had watched countless rulers come and go. She touched the small pendant resting against her heart and smiled gently, thinking not about forgotten bloodlines or royal recognition, but about her grandmother. For the first time, so many quiet lessons finally made sense. She understood why kindness had always mattered more than praise, why awareness had been practiced every morning, and why protecting others had never required applause. The greatest legacy her grandmother had left behind was never an ancient technique or a family name. It was the belief that true strength remained gentle even when no one was watching. A few moments later, Ethan Blackwood stepped onto the balcony overlooking the palace courtyard. He found Emily standing peacefully beneath the night sky. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence felt comfortable, filled only with the distant sound of fountains and the cool evening breeze. Finally, the Alpha King smiled. "The kingdom has waited a long time to remember the guardians," he said quietly. Emily looked toward the stars before answering. "I only did what anyone should do." Ethan shook his head with quiet admiration. Many people know what is right. Very few choose to act before someone else does. Emily lowered her eyes with the same humility she had carried throughout the evening. Nothing about her had truly changed. She was still the same young woman who had served guests with kindness, expected nothing in return, and believed every person deserved respect regardless of rank. Only now, the kingdom had finally learned to see what had always been there. Far beyond the palace walls, on a distant mountain overlooking the northern territories, a cloaked traveler stood beneath the moon, holding an old parchment marked with the ancient crescent moon crest. As the wind carried whispers through the pine forest, the traveler slowly smiled. "So the last guardian has finally revealed herself," the quiet voice murmured. The parchment was carefully rolled closed before the mysterious figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the moonlight behind. Somewhere beyond the horizon, forgotten chapters of history were beginning to awaken once again, and Emily Carter's journey had only just begun. The greatest adventures are often born from the smallest acts of courage, and sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the one who quietly changes the future for an entire kingdom. If Emily's kindness, courage, and humility touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next chapter of her journey. Leave a like if you believe true strength is shown through compassion rather than power. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even the quietest person can make the greatest difference. Finally, tell us in the comments, what moment impressed you the most? And if you had been in the Crystal Moon Palace that night, would you have recognized Emily's courage before everyone else did?